This is the Alex Pierson Show.
Welcome back. I'm Mike Drolet filling in for Alex Pierson for the week. Thanks for joining us. Oh, let's talk about a difficult one. These are sometimes called the third rail, the tough topics to talk about because you get people on either side and it's never pretty. People are furious on one side, furious on the other side, and not willing to listen. We're talking, of course, about the conflict in Gaza. If you hadn't heard, the fragile ceasefire was shattered early this morning as Israel carried out what it called extensive strikes on Hamas targets, leaving roughly 400 dead. So Hamas is accusing Israel of overturning the nearly 2-month ceasefire and putting the captives at risk, saying, watch out, if you keep on bombing, some of these 24 or so captives could be dying. Terrible. Absolutely horrendous. Israel is also accusing Hamas of repeatedly refusing to release the hostages and rejecting mediation offers. And it's been a frustrating time for them. Frustrating for the U.S. as well, trying to get in and negotiate a peace and get these hostages who have been, I can't imagine what it's like for them we know that a lot of them were living in tunnels, some of the ones that were released within the last couple of months, and they came out looking like skin and bones, horrendous, absolutely horrendous what happened to them. So we know that you're not going to convince a lot of people on either sides that the other side is right or wrong. But there is also the legal aspect of it. So, how do we look at this from a legal perspective? So let's talk to Natasha Hausdorff. She's a British barrister and expert commentator on international law, including the law of armed conflict, foreign affairs, and national security policy. And she joins us now. Natasha, thanks for joining us.
Mike, it's very good to be with you.
And the British accent, obviously, you're British. So thanks. Always like to have that in the morning. It's the early afternoon. But this has been such a crazy story. It's just a complete mess, right? So how do you break it down from a legal perspective? Does international law even apply here, or is it just two groups going at each other?
Oh, no, international law certainly applies. And Israel has been upholding international law, despite the fact that Hamas has used its abuses of international law as part of its modus operandi, putting civilians in the front line, firing onto Israeli civilians, shooting even its own civilians in Gaza, as Hamas has repeatedly been doing, both when Gazan civilians have been seeking to evacuate areas in accordance with Israeli evacuation plans, and also seeking to access aid that Israel has continued to facilitate throughout the last 17 months. But it's important, I think, that we're clear both on the factual analysis and the legal analysis. And you might not be surprised that I start by seeking to present perhaps the alternative, which is that this is a ceasefire which was predicated on an agreement brokered, of course, by many in the international community between Israel and this internationally prescribed terrorist organization Hamas, that has fallen apart after Hamas has refused repeatedly to release the remaining 59 hostages that it has continued to hold in Gaza terror tunnels, not all of which, unfortunately, are still alive, and has rejected repeated proposals by the United States. I mean, this is when the ceasefire, unfortunately, came to an end. And Israel's renewed strikes on Hamas infrastructure and terror targets in the Gaza Strip come in the wake of reports that Hamas was planning to repeat its incursion into Israel on the 7th of October 2023.
There have been reports that they were going to do that and launch it possibly from the West Bank as well.
Indeed.
There's been reports of that over a lot. That's tough for Israel to have to deal with. And we do know that Israel, it must be impossible for Israel to live in that area because everybody around them hates them. And Hamas, their only reason for being, it seems, is to kick Israel out of the area. And it doesn't matter. It must be, how do you negotiate a truce? How do you find some sort of legal avenue to be able to find a truce when the two parties dislike each other so much, but the one party just wants to knock the other party off the face of the earth?
Well, you've put your finger right on the conundrum here. Hamas has no interest in negotiating any conclusion to living alongside Israel. Its modus operandi, its raison d'etre, they're all geared towards killing as many Jews as possible. And you can't negotiate with people who just want to wipe Israel off of the face of the map. Unfortunately, though, the fact of the matter is that international law doesn't doesn't prevent Israel from exercising its lawful self-defense. Israel is fighting essentially an existential war here against Iranian terror proxies, not just Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, Hezbollah on the border with Lebanon, militia also in Iraq, in Syria. So in that context, international law is very clear about the measures that Israel is able to take and the framework that Israel has to adopt in targeting Hamas terror infrastructure and preventing civilian casualties wherever possible. And the received information from both on the ground in Gaza, the assessment of legal and military professionals of the US and the UK, those states that Israel has shared intelligence with as to its operations have consistently been that Israel is not only complying with international law, but in fact going far above the requirements of the law of armed conflict.
Well, I mean, we did get the report. And by the way, I'm joined by Natasha Hausdorff, who's a British barrister and expert commentator on international law. And you're mentioning it, talking about international law as it applies to Israel. Well, the UK government has just come out and said for the first time that they're actually breaking the law by stopping the aid going into Gaza.
Let me be very clear on that. David Lammy is wrong when he says that Israel has an obligation to continue to facilitate aid into the Gaza Strip, where it is clear that Hamas is diverting this aid and is using it to support its own terror infrastructure. The Geneva Convention and Article 23 thereof is perfectly plain that there is no obligation to continue to supply enemy forces where that aid is being used against Israel. And of course, Israel is not the only state that borders Hamas in Gaza. Egypt has a border which it has continued to fortify over the last 17 months. It has refused to allow any civilians to exit the Gaza Strip unless they pay extortionate amounts of money. But when I was there on the ground in Gaza in September last year with a military expert panel from 6 NATO states, we saw with our own eyes the incredible terror tunnel infrastructure that Hamas had constructed under the border with Egypt. There has been a free flow of Iranian-supplied munitions which have supplied Hamas's terror statelet since its violent takeover in 2007. Israel's continued facilitation of aid, of course, throughout the last 17 months is clear to anyone who has looked at the official data, including from COGAT, which is the unit of the Israeli Defense Forces that is responsible for looking after civilians in situations of armed conflict. And the average calorie count that Israel has facilitated into the Gaza Strip per person per day across this period is significantly in excess of the NHS guidelines on recommended calorific intake.
And yet the food isn't getting through, as we've seen. And also they're trying to negotiate, try to deal with this, and they see that the tunnels are still there. And clearly Hamas is not going to give up because they've stated that their intention is to continue with this, is to be able to, they certainly want Israel to be wiped off the face of the mat. Last thing, we're coming up on time here, but I want to ask you quickly about how difficult it must be to be able, because the international law in conflict, it states that all parties must distinguish at all times between combatants and civilians, but it's hard to tell between the two. We've seen that in Afghanistan, in Vietnam, and conflicts there, where you can't tell who is who. And this is part of the problem. So people criticize Israel for bombing Hamas and the Gaza Strip and killing civilians, which is horrific, but they also don't know exactly who's who. So how do you navigate through that? If you can, I mean, that's a tough one to be able to digest, but if you can give us that quickly, an answer to that quickly, that'd be great.
Well, this is why Israel has continued to seek to evacuate civilians from the areas that it is targeting with Hamas terror infrastructure. Of course, Hamas is trying to frustrate that by using civilians as human shields and by basing its activities out of mosques, schools, and hospitals, which therefore become military targets when they are being used as terror infrastructure. One thing I would stress is that what we are hearing in the international media and the reporting that is coming out of Gaza is entirely controlled by Hamas. And we need to be very circumspect, especially when we're hearing about the levels of supposed casualties that Hamas are putting out in press releases as of this morning.
Yes.
We know that there have been tens of senior Hamas officials that have been eliminated as a result of these strikes. We can tell that they are targeted. And those of us that have been privy to Israel's proportionality and targeting exercises can see that the level of intelligence that Israel is basing its strikes on is very carefully considered. And the proportionality analysis that it is conducting means that it is pinpointing terrorists throughout the Gaza Strip and avoiding civilian casualties wherever possible, despite Hamas' best efforts to increase the civilian casualty count as much as it can.
Well, I mean, we know that when they get the headlines for the casualty counts, it really works in their favor, and that leads to people yelling and screaming in the streets, and the conflict goes on and on and on. Natasha, I wish we had more time to talk about this. I appreciate it. Natasha Hausdorff, a barrister and a commentator in international law. Thanks for joining us.
It's great to be with you. Thank you.